Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear students, dear participants of the conference on Rousseau, Poland and Europe, Federalism, Sovereignty, Prosperity, Patriotism. The question may arise of why the College of Europe, an institution dedicated to contemporary European studies and serving to current and future needs of the European Union, should host a conference dedicated to an 18th century philosopher. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is not at first sight an obvious choice of subject for us here at the College of Europe. At first sight. On closer examination, Rousseau and his writings, especially his Considérations sur le gouvernement de Pologne, turns out to be quite an obvious means of posing fundamental questions about Europe, fundamental questions which are as relevant today as they were 250 years ago. In the same way, back in 2009, to the surprise of some colleagues at the College of Europe, the Natolin campus hosted a conference on Marcus Aurelius' political theory and political practice. This event was organized in cooperation with Artes Liberales, Faculty of Warsaw University, and the yearbook Teologia Polityczna, and marked the year of Marcus Aurelius as patron of the College of Europe here in Poland and in Belgium, in Bruges. It provided the opportunity to pose fundamental political, philosophical, and religious questions at the heart of the idea of European civilization. The apparently far from obvious turned out to be obvious. A similarly broad view of Europe was taken by the major conference organized at Natolin by the European Civilization Chair in 2016, The Fate of Freedom in Eastern Europe, Autocracy, Oligarchy, Anarchy, and covering several countries from the Middle Age to the present day, brought together historians, philosophers, and political scientists to consider whether in this part of Europe liberty is or is not fated to degenerate into autocracy, oligarchy, or anarchy. The present conference on Rousseau, Poland and Europe picks up the theme of the fate of freedom and takes it further. Rousseau hoped that in Poland the degeneration of modern European civilization he saw elsewhere could be avoided, precisely because of Poles' exceptional attachment to liberty. The four themes of the conference, Federalism, Sovereignty, Prosperity, and Patriotism, are interlinked by the idea of freedom. Rousseau's interest in Poland was shared by many other Western European thinkers at that time. Although the country was then bested by crises and falling under Russian domination, its underlying vitality attracted more independent minds who defied conventions and orthodoxies. Some of those thinkers will also be discussed at this conference. So not just Rousseau, but the Poland of the later 18th century turns out to be more important to Europe than might have been obvious then and now. Rousseau posed radical challenges to the European political and intellectual elites of his time. Those challenges resonate today, when some Europeans seek foundations in shared values and heritage for the political and economic structures of further integration. Faced with a combination of crises in a rapidly changing world, Europeans cannot avoid uncomfortable questions about what they are and about what they are heading. The Natolin campus of the College of Europe does not take a narrowly focused technocratic view of Europe. We do not identify Europe only with the current institutions and acquis communautaire of the Union. Here we take a longer and wider view of Europe, a Europe that is larger and older than the European Union, a Europe of which the European Union is a part, an important part, however, only a part. It is for this reason that Natolin campus hosts two academic chairs, a neighborhood policy chair held by Professor Tobias Schumacher It works as much on the perspective of the European Union's neighbors as on the European Union's approaches to its neighbors. The other is the European Civilization Chair, which has organized this conference, and I would like to take the liberty to thank to Professor Butterwick for organizing this event for us today. European history and civilization is not just one of the 4 second semester majors in our program. It is the foundation of our program, I have to say. We believe that the problems of the present and the future are best tackled through an understanding of the heritage of the past, with all its examples, patterns, and warnings. Dear guests, dear participants, I wish all of you, everybody, a very successful conference, fruitful and good discussions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Pani Rector, thank you for your gracious words of introduction and welcome. And thank you for your support of this conference. Without you, it could not have happened. I would also like to thank all of the staff here at Natolin who have worked so hard to bring about this event, notably Marek Rybak, Dorota Wronkowska, and especially Anna Banak. A special thank you to Graham Clear, with my former colleague here, with whom this conference has been planned and who has taken on most of the correspondence with our speakers. Good to have you back. I'd also like to thank the University of Lausanne for its support of the conference and the Polish Society for 18th Century Studies. Last but not least, thank you to our speakers for making the journey and being part of this project. And thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence tonight. I also have a sadder reason to express particular thanks to Dr. Michael SONENSCHER. The partner in tonight's debate was to have been Dr. Christopher Brooke. He cannot, alas, be with us because 2 days ago, his father, the judge, Sir Henry Brooke, died. Dr. SONENSCHER is to give one of the key papers to this conference on Saturday morning on Rousseau and Federalism, has very kindly agreed to step into Dr. Brooke's shoes. We are most grateful for you, while wishing the circumstances had been different. Pani Rector, distinguished guests, students, colleagues, Jean-Jacques Rousseau liked being provocative, from his first major work to his last. Consider, please, passages such as this. L'éducation nationale n'appartient qu'aux hommes libres. Il n'y a que qui ait une existence commune et qui soit vraiment liée par la loi. Un Français, un Anglais, un Espagnol, un Italien, un Russe sont tous à peu près le même homme. Ils sortent du collège, déjà façonné pour la licence, c'est-à-dire pour la servitude. À 20 ans, un Polonais ne doit pas être un autre homme, il doit être un Polonais. Strong stuff. Some might call it nationalist. It might explain why Rousseau has not yet been chosen as a patron de promotion by the College of Europe. Or perhaps it might not. The quotation comes from Rousseau's Considérations sur le gouvernement de Pologne, his last major political work. This was and remains one of his least understood works. It was undertaken shortly after he had written a project for a constitution for the Corsicans, who were engaged in a struggle for their independence. This time, Rousseau was asked for his advice by Michał Wielchowski, the representative in France of a group of Polish nobles who had formed a confederation or armed league in a state of national emergency. The Confederates of Mar, whose 250th anniversary is being marked in Poland this year. They had previously asked another philosophe based in France, Gabriel Bonneau de Mably. Now they wanted another opinion. Rousseau's Considérations sur le gouvernement de Pologne et sur sa réformation projetée were completed by the end of 1771. They circulated in manuscript for just over a decade before they began to appear in posthumous editions of his works and separately from 1782 onwards. A Polish translation was first published in 1789. As we shall see in the course of this conference, this work had considerable contemporary resonance in Poland, in France, and elsewhere. Among scholars, however, full appreciation of its place in Rousseau's own oeuvre and in late 18th century political, cultural, and economic discourses has been made more difficult by the complexity of the little-known Polish context for which it was written. There have been several learned and ingenious interpretations of Rousseau's Considérations, particularly among scholars of political thought and economy, and theorists of nationalism. However, they have until recently been reduced to guesswork about Rousseau's sources on Poland. The man who discovered these sources, supplied to both Mably and Rousseau by Wielholski, was the Polish historian Jerzy Michalski, born in 1924, died in 2007. I shall say a bit more about Professor Michalski tomorrow morning, in the presence of some of those who knew him better than I did. For now, I wish to pay tribute to an 18th century scholar of great versatility, erudition, and above all, rigor. Versatility, because he wrote path-breaking work in the history of law, the history of science, historiography, social history, the history of domestic and international politics, and the history of political ideas. Erudition, he had an extraordinary, if sparingly displayed, grasp of the classics, ancient and modern, not to mention an encyclopedic knowledge of sources relating to the 18th century Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Rigor, because his method was invariably to assemble all relevant sources for the given subject, compare and assess them with the utmost criticism and skepticism, and then to argue the most plausible case possible. His works have stood the test of time, even in the 1950s, at the heart of ideological pressure on historians, differ little in style or method from those written in the early 2000s. He had a natural length of 80 to 120 pages, so long articles and short books. Rousseau i Sarmacki Republicanism, published in 1977, is one of the latter. It is, however, long on content and argument. It establishes what Rousseau was told and what he did with that information and those arguments. This leads to an explanation in this context of Rousseau's case made in the Considérations, and that permits conclusions on what Rousseau had in common with the Polish Republican tradition and where he departed from it. Despite a 5-page résumé in French, Michalski's book was long unknown to most international Rousseau scholars. I hope that has now changed following the publication 2 years ago of the translation into English, which I promised the professor long ago. If this project and conference is an opportunity to evaluate the contribution made by a Polish historian to our understanding of Rousseau's thought, it is also an opportunity to re-evaluate the place of Poland in later 18th century conversations and discourses about reform, enlightenment, and revolution. We shall also be reflecting, especially tonight, on why advice dispensed by Rousseau to Polish Confederates nearly 250 years ago can still resonate for Poles and Europeans today. Questions which have not lost their relevance include: how can liberty, however understood, be preserved in a territorially extensive republic? What are the similarities and differences between ancient and Renaissance city republics and modern representative federal republics? Second, what is the role of the monarch or president in a republic? Did Rousseau and his contemporaries view republicanism and monarchism as mutually exclusive or as complementary? Third, how can an entire people come to share in popular sovereignty? How can serfs or slaves become citizens? Fourth, how can the agricultural and commercial sectors of the economy grow in a balanced fashion, avoiding excessive inequality and corresponding political conflicts between rural and urban populations? Graham came up with an analogy between Polska A and Polska bear in precisely this context. What kind of patriotism is required to produce solidarity and stability in different kinds of societies, ancient, modern, and contemporary? Can studying the ideal of citizenship in an aristocratic or noble republic yield any lessons for citizenship in today's world? To help us do so, we are privileged to welcome tonight two marvellous historians. From King's College, Cambridge, Dr. Michael SONENSCHER, one of the world's leading scholars of 18th and 19th century political and economic thought, especially in France. He first made his name with two books in the late 1980s, The Hatters of 18th century France and Work and Wages, Natural Law, Politics, and 18th century French Trades. Then in the late 2000s came two more major monographs, Before the Deluge, Public Debt, Inequality, and the Intellectual Origins of the French Revolution, and Sans-Culotte, an 18th century emblem in the French Revolution. Not to mention editions of key texts, for example, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, and influential articles and edited collections, the most recent of which is Politics and Commercial Society, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Adam Smith, co-edited with Béla Kaposi, also with us, and the late István Hont. Thank you once again, Dr. SONENSCHER. From the Jagiellonian University in Krakow and from the Institute of History at the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, our own visiting professor, Andrzej NOWAK. Professor NOWAK is not only an outstanding historian of Poland and Russia and of places betwixt and between, in the period from the late 18th century to the present, whose works, including The First Treachery of the West, 1920, A Forgotten Appeasement, have won numerous prizes and awards. His current project, which is redolent of the great 19th century historians in its scope, is a multi-volume history of Poland, and the leitmotif of this project is the idea and practice of liberty. He is one of the co-creators of the discipline of imperiology, and one of Poland's leading public intellectuals, a major and a measured presence in debates about the politics of history and memory and on Poland's foreign policy. Among his many and varied interests is Rousseau's place in the Polish Republican tradition. Professor NOWAK has agreed to speak first. Now, each of our speakers will first have about 10 minutes for his initial remarks. Then they will have the opportunity to reply to each other for no more than 5 minutes. We shall then take comments and questions from the floor for about 20 minutes, and then at the end, each of the speakers will have 5 minutes. So, thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, and I am delighted to give the floor to Andrzej NOWAK.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I am really privileged, and at the same time I feel a little bit uncomfortable in front of so many distinguished and real, so to speak, specialists in Rousseau. I am just a pirate from 19th century coming to a strange land of 18th century philosophers. But the subject encourages me because it's not the subject of our contemporary, I mean tonight's debate is not completely engulfed in 18th century, but it pertains to our times. Why is Rousseau's advice to Poles still relevant to Europe today? Well, probably it's not only because he suggests more gymnastics in high schools or colleges. And probably it is also not only because, or rather not, because of his advice to ally with Turkish Sultan as the only possibility for Poles. Though nowadays it may be the only option. That's another truth. The fact is that the subject seems to me very serious and very challenging, very interesting. And I think that the most provocative in Rousseau's advice to Europe today was already touched by Professor Butterwick introductory remarks. I mean Rousseau's words about corruption of people, of men and women, by economy, actually. This is something that seems especially absurd when we confront Rousseau's advice with realities of late 18th century Poland or Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland and Lithuania badly needed economic reforms and economic revival that would give them possibility to withstand the real challenge of not only military forces of the Commonwealth neighbors, but also of money that formed something like a base for this military imbalance that doomed the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So, seen from the perspective of 18th century, from the perspective of, let's say, historian of Stanislas August, efforts to reform Poland, this kind of advice could be and should be rejected as absurd. When we read these famous words, maybe I will just quote them very briefly. That if Poles want to cultivate arts, sciences, commerce, and industry, have professional soldiers, fortresses, and academies, and above all, a good system of public finance, which will make money, they will turn as bad as the rest of Europe. So this is against Rousseau's advice. Well, it is absurd. But at the same time, I would agree with Rousseau. It's economy stupid. This is the source of our today's problems in Europe. Not in terms of GDP of Europe as compared with China or with the United States or any other country or a lot of countries, but the fact that economy dominated so much over politics that consumer is ready to consume citizen. And this is exactly the problem that is dealt with Rousseau's arguments, I believe. And that's why it seems to me it is still worth reading. Rousseau was aware that he could be read as trying to turn Poland into a nation of mendicant friars. These are his particular words. But actually, the more ambitious goal of his advice was to create men not for sale. These are also his words, to create or to recreate men not for sale. It seems very apt nowadays that we tend to be more and more for sale not only in terms of our, I would say, everyday behavior, but what is at stake is our more stable identity, both individual and what is dealt more precisely by Rousseau in his considerations of any community, a more stable identity. And that's why I would suggest to concentrate, when any one of you would decide to read considerations or reread considerations on the government of Poland, on his proposal, that is to make a case for a republican patriotism. I think this is his real answer for the problem created by domination of economy, of money, of turning both individual and communal identities into commodities. His answer is connecting federalism with republican patriotism. And it is developed, of course, in a chapter on education. Why patriotism seems to me worth reconsidering now. I would use words of another great historian, not Polish this time, but a historian from New Zealand, or from Cambridge, if you will. I mean J.G.A. Pocock, who stated in his one of his last book, in conclusion, History, Sovereignty, Identity, there is reason, quotation mark, to suspect that the ideological offensive against political association capable of making, remembering, interpreting, and questioning their own history has reached the point where the individual as well as the collective self is targeted for demolition. There are forces in our world that do not wish us to say we or act on that basis, since to do so might impede their selling us a new identity tomorrow. So I think this is the crux of the problem. And why patriotism is, Republican patriotism is advertised, so to speak, by Rousseau as, or might be advertised as something like an answer for this problem, is first because it is not patriotism, right or wrong, my country. No, this is patriotism based on a universal ideal immersed in a particular community. And in that case, it is ideal of republican liberty, non-domination ideal, as Philippe Petit would put it, as opposed to liberal ideal of non-interference. And particular ideal that was developed according to the sources given to Rousseau in Polish-Lithuanian Republic was taken seriously in that version of patriotism that was developed, especially in chapter on education, as a way out from the problem of Europe of 18th century, and might be considered also one of ways out from the problems of Europe of 21st century. Because detached from community, from this patriotic, so to speak, education that was stressed so highly by Rousseau, I will be also always apt to lose my hold up on all genuine standards of judgment. Loyalty to that community, to the hierarchy of particular kinship, particular local community, and particular natural community is, or could be at least, something like a natural context or a prerequisite for morality. It is always easier when our surrounding, our natural community, gives us a sign of disapproval that we are doing wrong than when we are only treated as abstract, universal individuals. A central contention of the morality of that kind of patriotism is that I will obliterate and lose a central dimension of the moral life if I don't understand the enacted narrative of my own individual life as embedded in the history of my country. That's why Rousseau put so much stress on teaching history of one's country. For if I don't understand it, I will not understand why I owe to others or what others do owe for me.
When we're talking about Republican patriotism, we're talking about communities and the degree to which the community supplies the array of norms and values and guidance and what have you that enable people to lead lives that would otherwise be atomized and fragmented and generally not the kind of lives which people should apparently have. And this is something that apparently Rousseau endorsed. What I want to try and do in 10 minutes is to say why this is not quite the whole story, and why the story is actually a more complicated one, because it's a story which doesn't involve simply communities, but also involves each of us individually, and involves a capacity to think about who we are, to think about the choices that are possible for us, and to think about the reasons why the kinds of choices that we might wish to make will be our choices, so that the picture will be one in which things rather more to do with laws and government and states rather than communities figure rather more prominently in Rousseau's thought than I think we have just been told. So there are two broad ways, I think, in which Rousseau talks about communities, and they're both present in this fine book of Jerzy Michalski, which I think does explain why Rousseau is so interesting and why his book on Poland is also particularly interesting. Michalski's book, on the one hand, and as we've, I think, just heard very eloquently, highlights Rousseau's strong endorsement of small-scale, vibrant communities, like the hymn-singing, cuckoo clock-making community of the Valais, which, as I think François Rousseau says in his paper that we'll hear tomorrow or the day after, highlights what Jean Fabre called the premier roman de l'énergie nationale. And this characterization of Rousseau picks up something quite important about Rousseau's strong hostility towards empire, and the degree to which the types of empire, Prussian, Austrian, Russian, were responsible for the partition of Poland, and the degree to which all of Rousseau's political thought is essentially a matter of trying to think about what the alternative to empire might look like. Important subject, particularly if you're Swiss, because whatever else Switzerland had, it was less, perhaps, inclined towards empire than, let's say, Britain or France or Russia. So, on the one hand, there is this endorsement of community. On the other hand, there is this opposition to empire. And the question that this combination raises is whether Rousseau's alternative to empire was a community, or a Gemeinschaft, or a state, and a Gesellschaft. I don't think that in his book, Michalski quite saw this question, so it's not clear on his reading of Rousseau's considerations on the government of Poland whether the alternative to empire was a nation or a state, or a Gemeinschaft rather than a Gesellschaft. The main reason, I think, for this uncertainty was that Michalski was writing at a time when the subject of the relation between Rousseau and Hobbes was not as prominent as it had been in the 18th century, or as it has become in the early 21st century, thanks mainly to the work of Richard Tuck and Istvan Hont. Hont, in his book about Smith and Rousseau, described Rousseau as a very sophisticated advocate of what in the 18th century was usually called the selfish system. In other words, something which began with the self and to some degree also ended with the self. And I think that Istvan Hont was right, and that this makes Michalski somewhat wrong, but that he was right in a way that also makes sense of Michalski's interest in community and nationality. And here, the key difference and similarity is in the idea of the self. That was the basis of Rousseau's version of the selfish system, because the self in question was a reflexive self, a sort of double self, a self reflecting on itself and on its own abilities to be or do what it decided. This is what Rousseau took this notion of amour propre and pride and reflexivity to entail. So whatever that type of self might be, it won't be a simple physical self. And because it isn't a simple physical self, it won't be entirely subject to what is supplied to it from the outside, whether in terms of the physical environment or in terms of all the things that are supplied by the physical senses, supplied, of course, by a community. So it's not so much the outside and its capacity to generate norms that mattered within Rousseau, but something going on in this rather more elaborate relationship between what is physical and what is moral, or between the self and the reflexive self. And as a result, the self will, in short, be a sort of human, or to put it slightly differently, a cultured self, rather than an animal self. In other words, chickens do what chickens do for fairly uniform physical reasons. Humans do what humans do for rather local and parochial reasons. Animals, in other words, behave in pretty uniform ways and are, you could say, spontaneously cosmopolitan. Humans don't have this sort of spontaneous cosmopolitan quality built into them. Instead, they have languages and they have values and they have a range of resources supplied to them by their cultures. And these provide them with a range of mechanisms or resources that make you and me and everybody rather different from one another. And so the question would then be, what, given this reflexive quality, might be possible for humans to have in common? And then you would have to have something about the things that are sort of more than the particular. In other words, things to do with the uniformity of legislation, the uniformity of the law, and the uniformity of something which Rousseau called famously the general will, whose content is, well, rather different from the content that makes me, me, or you, or us, but is, well, a general will, which it doesn't have a content until it does have a content, and is always something which is supplied by us in certain ways, according to certain kinds of procedures, according usually to certain kinds of constitutional provisions, according, in other words, to things that are slightly different from the particularities that make communities what they are. So there is a kind of duality involved in thinking about political societies and the human beings who make up these political societies. There are two bits to think about rather than one. And thinking in terms of one, namely a community, is to think about something a little bit more abbreviated than Rousseau encourages us, I think, to think. We have to think about two things, the general and the local, the global and the particular. And because there are two things, we have a lot to think about, always. And that's what makes Rousseau interesting. Okay?
Thank you. Professor Novak, would you like to respond?
I would like rather to continue. Let me begin with the question of our lecture of rereading of Rousseau. I think it is important to its rereading in Polish historical context the experience of 19th century. That time when Rousseau's consideration were read as something like a manual how to survive without a state. So that's why the stress was put on community, nationality, rather than on laws and state. I think this is the experience that was already felt, so to speak, on the verge of the 19th century, in the end of 18th century, but especially made something like a prism through which we, most of us Poles, do read Rousseau afterwards, after the partitions. But I think more interesting are questions connected, first, to me, the most interesting question is an alternative to empire. So I could do with this question with a joke. It could be either island or the Alps. Geographical dimension matters. And it is stressed from the very beginning by Rousseau that Poland was encircled by empires and how to survive in that particular geopolitical environment. His answer is, I should repeat, to create or to strengthen rather republican federal structure based on especially vibrant education of republican virtues. And I think that self-reflective self you mentioned has to be educated in a community through laws enacted in a republic. That is still the way, I believe, that is presented in Rousseau's advice, so to speak. But finally, I would add something like a paradox to your last point. Namely, you mentioned this metaphor of humans and animals, chicken and man. I think the paradox of Rousseau is that he sometimes represents an intellectual, an elite that sees itself as a human herding hordes of chicken or animals. It is not exactly the case of considerations, because he was asked and he heard, but by other humans. But he criticized exactly that amour propre that drove him, as well as other humans, in his colleagues, philosophes or intellectuals of 18th century France or Germany, that were asked not by other groups, communities, but by emperors, how to remold herds of chicken living in Russia, in other imperial structures. And I believe this is a paradox also worth considering in reading Rousseau.
Sorry about the chickens.
Respond.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the chickens. We can stop talking about chickens. There's a phrase that Rousseau used to use, which he took from a book by the Polish king or prince Stanislas Leszczyński. Thank you so much. And it goes, in libertate labor, in servitude dolor. That you have to work in order to be free, and if you don't work and you herd chickens, or no, that's maybe too much like hard work, but if you go shopping, then, well, that also could be like hard work, but if you just consume, then it's not going to work. So there is a kind of preoccupation with, let's call it industry and energy and collective and individual activity, which is also connected to the way in which a community might be able to work. So alongside of the community will be the conditions, in other words, that give rise to this precondition of liberty. And we can talk about those. And they will be the kinds of preconditions which, as I've been trying to emphasize, are general. And that's the important thing about Rousseau, that there's this combination of the generality and the particularity. And you have to try to see that you can't have the one without dealing with the other. And it's not easy to see how the two things do coexist and interact and relate to one another unless you pay quite a lot of attention to the way in which the various bits and pieces between the humans and the institutions and the conceptual components of a society are articulated with one another. And so I'm not entirely disagreeing with the emphasis that you have placed on the alternatives to empire or the nature of community. What I'm trying to suggest is that there are a rather larger number of preconditions, and that these preconditions are quite important to not just recognize as preconditions, but also as the prerequisites for the kind of arrangements and the vitality, if you like, of this combination of individuality and community that Rousseau took to be what makes a political society different from, well, chickens.
All right. Thank you both for those responses to each other. We're now going to move into the 20 minutes or so where members of the audience are invited to make their comments or to ask questions of our two panelists. Perhaps I'll offer the first thought that, and I'll address this question to all those who know about these things better than I do. Is there any work in Rousseau's oeuvre where this great individual, perhaps the most individual of all the philosophers of the 18th century, is less concerned with the self than in the Considérations sur le gouvernement de Pologne? And if that point is valid, and it may not be, is that because he was simply because he was responding to a commission for a particular task, or does it represent some phase in his late thought? So I'll just throw that one up to start with and invite other comments and questions. We do have a microphone or two microphones, and please wait for it to arrive before you start. Go on, don't be shy.
I can suggest an answer.
Oh, please do. Let's go straight away then.
Yeah, his work is saturated with those kinds of claims and comments. I mean, if you think about what he had to say about when he looked back to his childhood and he remembered all the people in Geneva coming out on the streets and they were joyfully celebrating whatever themselves, as it were, on some military militia, whatever it was, then it's a splendid and marvelous and epic celebration of the collective self of the inhabitants of Geneva. There are all these discussions of, well, why the theatre and what the difference between a theatrical persona and a personal persona might be. So I think I mean, what he has to say about Poland is simply the Polish illustration of this more general characterization about personality. He had a big argument with this person called Claude Adrien Helvetius, who wrote a famous book called De l'Esprit, in which the nub of the argument was, well, it's the inside rather than the outside that determines who we are. And De l'Esprit was making a big argument about the degree to which it's the outside rather than the inside that determines who we are. So it's you know, Rousseau is spiritual, if you like, or personal, or what have you, all the way through. Yeah? Yeah.
Short question to Mike SONENSCHER. Have you been reading Hegel a lot recently? Because, I mean, yes, I come back to larger point, but sort of the reading that you present of Rousseau is very much like, almost like a Hegelian perspective in order to make sense of sort of the relationship of how we become an agent who holds certain beliefs and also sort of shares certain norms, and sort of being part of something that has to do with our social existence, sort of that we can only sort of recognize something as an acting in the light of others' actions and sort of being challenged by others about our actions. So I don't know whether that is relevant for sort of also understanding Rousseau, and sort of also with the question that eventually you can also only become really a free self by being part sort of a state and maybe not a community. The interesting thing, which I would like to, the question which still troubles me a bit, is a bit like an old question from ancient Rousseau scholarship, maybe kind of Judith Sklar's age, because sort of when you go back to a lot of the old Rousseau scholarship, there was a huge emphasis on that Rousseau always offered us vast or very strong choices in life. Like the choice between being a citizen and being a human being, or like a man, as in the opening paragraphs of Emile. And I was wondering how that relates, maybe to both, how that relates to sort of the stuff that he writes in the Considération, in a way that sort of one of the advantages of the Poles is that they're actually not very cultured, they're not very well developed as an individual, maybe as a community, or whatever you'd like to call it, which sort of offers us sort of like an opportunity actually to become a self. So the Poles are not a self, but have to become one. And that's maybe how I understand also Mike Sonenscher's remarks, that sort of the challenge of this text is in a way also that it's not just you can do these pity and these sort of small type reforms, but you have to make a vast sort of decision about your future. I don't know whether that helps.
Rousseau didn't read Hegel, so... and yes, there's a 19th century book by somebody called Anthony Ritchie, perhaps, called Natural Rights Theory, which subsequently became the same title as Richard Tuck's book. And I remember Ritchie liking reading it. He wrote it in about 1870-something, saying that Rousseau's true intellectual and political heirs weren't Robespierre and Saint-Just and these French Jacobins, but Kant, Fichte and Hegel. And that seems to me now very, very clear that there is more, in other words, on the side of what people could get out of Rousseau. And what I've been trying to suggest is not so much that Rousseau produced elaborate treatises of the noumenal and phenomenal selves and the things that were subsequently done, but that these are there. And it doesn't take a huge amount to see that you can do these kinds of things. And there was enough in Rousseau, particularly if you read the things that arose from his discussion with Helvetius and the things that he had to say about music and what, broadly speaking, came to be called aesthetics, is there. And it matters for thinking about Rousseau's politics in a way which makes thinking about things like communities and culture and tradition and the kinds of, let's call them, resources that people might have from the past, rather more a matter of how these things were created and used rather than simply how these things were inherited and endorsed. And it's that aspect of Rousseau which I think is very important.
Good evening, Carsten Gerards from the Simon Weil promotion. I'm a student this year. Looking at my notes and reading the topic of today, advising Europe, there was one name coming to my mind, the top advisor of Europe today, probably Jürgen Habermas, from a philosophical perspective. And reading my notes, and especially your remarks, Professor Nowak, I would be interested in how things like consumerist critique of consumerism, Republican patriotism, patriotisms around the notion of liberty is compatible with the ideas of a constitutional patriotism. And so probably you could elaborate on that. That was just something that coming to my mind.
Please. So I think the key element in the answer is the concept of public sphere by Habermas. That is the sphere in which these different parts of a larger body of politics, of a federation, and of different individuals living as citizens in that body could exchange actually their views and form, so to speak, a soul of that body. This is only a metaphor, of course. So I think the problem that could be somehow touched upon presciently by Rousseau is that there is not a public sphere in consumerist societies, that it could be kept only in vibrant republics when there is something like agora of these citizens. Of course, he looks back to ancient Greek and to models of maybe not rather Athens but Sparta in his advice to Poland. But I think the key element lacking in his vision of Europe is exactly public sphere, the element that is mentioned as a key element in the structure proposed by Habermas. And I think it is more and more question mark. Do we have this public sphere in Europe now? Or we have a lot of ghetto and more closed, more and more linked with their own media, with their own languages, and I don't mean Polish or English or French, but different ideological languages that do not communicate with each other. So that would be only a suggestion of an answer, not a full answer, because it would take more time. But let me just add something like a comment to your question. I think that the interpretation you suggested, that maybe Poles or Polish community or Polish individuals rather, or Polish-Lithuanian individuals were treated by Rousseau as somehow less cultural, less prepared to be self-reflective selves than in Geneva or in France. And that's why it was easier to construct there an ideal, a political idea. I think this point was developed well by Larry Wolff in his historical, not philosophical analysis of comparative analysis of Rousseau and Voltaire in his Inventing Eastern Europe. This would be a case of Orientalism, actually, and nothing less. But I think this is a very reductionist perspective on Rousseau. And I think it could be put into a perspective. Let us compare Rousseau not just with Hegel, but with Herder. I think Herder is a tempting reference point for reflections of Rousseau on Poles, on Slavs in that respect, or in Eastern or on Eastern Europe. So that's only my suggestion.
I'm Kasia Grzma from alumni of the College of Europe, Skłodowska-Curie promotion. I would like to remark on Professor Nowak statement where that it was very inspiring that what you said about the consumer eats citizen, and that actually Rousseau sort of predicts this today's situation. But you also mentioned Rousseau's economical thought, and here I would like to express some concern, because from what I read in Considération, his economical ideas are not very down to earth. And let's not forget that Rousseau's economical thought is avant la lettre Marxiste, if I can say that. So he blames in essay about origins of inequality, actually, he blames private property for the greed, for rivalry among human beings and stuff. Or actually, so it's a very revolutionary thought, and we have to keep in mind also the whole Rousseau's thought is filled with inner contradictions, of course, but we can't forget about this sort of crazy ideas of Rousseau's as well. So one needs to be very careful, trying to invoke Rousseau's economical ideas, first of all. And as for Republican patriotism, or the idea of patriotism he gives in Consideration, is I think it's not a universal idea because his ideas and suggestions he gives to Poles have to be read in the very specific political context of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of the late 18th century, because if they actually, and they are, in my opinion, historical artifact rather than some universal message or something to be read today. Yeah, that's all the remarks. Thank you.
This will perhaps take a couple more questions before we'll give our speakers a chance to make a final statement each.
Moment for music. Everyone to college. Yes, it's fine. So the question is very simply how to compare Adam Smith and Rousseau on the best possible institution or sort of government, form of government. Because some scholars are supposing that there are some similarities between Smith and Rousseau in terms of the moral foundations of the government. But sometimes they are supposing that Smith was somehow critical of Rousseau's point of view on how the government or the laws of justice are composed originally. Thanks very much.
Right. There are a couple of points I would sort of still like to raise with our speakers. The first is this question of cosmopolitanism, which, so we've heard, is sort of natural to chickens, but not necessarily to human beings. We won't forget those chickens now, that's for certain. And if you read Rousseau's Considérations sur le gouvernement de Pologne at face value, it looks as though there's virtually nothing worse than a cosmopolitan who is at home everywhere, sort of as long as he can find money to steal and women to corrupt, then they're at home. Is a text like this an aberration for Rousseau? Is it something that in the early 21st century we should still be taking seriously as a warning of what Theresa May recently said? If you are told you are citizens of nowhere, do we take that sort of stuff seriously today? Is it there in the Considérations sur le gouvernement de Pologne? Or is there perhaps something under this, a rather more profound method about humanity in general and the role of individuals with regard to that humanity in general, which allows us to see beyond the idea that the principal aim of education is to so educate Poles, and by extension people of any other nationality, so that never in their life will they be Russians? If there are no other questions, then I'd ask each of our speakers to make a final response in turn.
I'm polite. Shall I go first then?
Yeah, we'll do it the other way around.
Okay, let's deal with the chicken question first. Usually, and it's probably not entirely a mistake that we've made this or ended up with this comparison between humans and other creatures. what came out of Rousseau was instead a comparison not so much between humans and chickens, but between humans and angels. And the difference between chickens and angels is that angels don't have bodies, whereas humans do. And this means that human life is likely to be limited and parochial and lived in time and have all those attributes that apparently angels don't have. And this has a bearing on some of the things that Rousseau did have to say about why cosmopolitanism isn't humanly feasible, because, well, humans aren't angels. Humans have bodies, and humans, therefore, are obliged to live within the framework supplied by their physical natures, but also have something which is more than something purely physical. So there, as I've been trying to emphasize, there is this sort of dualism. And this dualism is the thing that has to be borne constantly in mind, because if there are two things to think about, you can't just think about one. And that, I think, has a bearing on some of the other things that people have raised about, for example, Smith and Rousseau on government. I don't know what Smith had to say about government. Istvan Hont wrote a marvelous book which sort of doesn't say a huge amount about Smith on government, doesn't say a huge amount about Rousseau on government, other than the fact that government, in both cases, is worth thinking about in a rather different sequence from the sequence in which it was standardly usual to do so. I could say quite a lot about Rousseau on government. I'll do that on whenever it is, Saturday, I believe. And so I won't say anything more now, but I would say that Rousseau has a great deal to say about government, of a very interesting sort, about the properties of a federal system of government. And we can talk about that, and I also would like to, because I don't actually understand it very well. So there's that. And then there's this business about Rousseau and private property and what have you, which is sort of tricky, because there will be private property, and then there will be inequality, and there isn't, though, an obvious alternative that Rousseau makes available in the form of, well, communism or collective property or something of that sort. Instead, there is something called welfare, and provision for providing for people who are not able to live off their own resources by means of resources supplied by something, the financial, fiscal systems and what have you. So there is property, and then there's something beyond property, but which is also property and which is connected to people's entitlements and what have you. And so it's a little bit more complicated than either property or no property, but entitlements and provisions that are supplied by, well, us, because we, in some sort of sense, decide what the general will be. So I'm not entirely persuaded that the question of property as such works. Also because Rousseau is always very clear that it's not so much property which is mine which matters, but property which is yours, which I recognize as being yours, which is a matter of, again, how the law works. And how the law works is connected also to this last subject, which I made a little note about, which is the Habermas, public opinion and public sphere question, because it's Rousseau who sort of started off Habermas in some sort of sense in his letter to D'Alembert, where he says, for the first time, that the thing that really counts in political societies is public opinion. And the thing that can be used to make public opinion count is not shouting at people or even advertising or what have you, but the law. Because what the law will do, he says, when you're talking about trying to get rid of dueling, he says, what the law can do is take some of the edge out of politics and turn what might otherwise be political questions into legal questions. And because they are legal questions, they will be subject to discussion and disagreement and argument of a rather specialized kind. And that's what, well, for example, the European Court was for a long time able to do in Europe. It took the politics out of Europe and transferred politics into legality. Now, you know, it isn't going to work all the time all that well, and in Britain it seems not to have worked particularly well for the present time. But there's an idea there which is worth thinking about, that you don't have to think in terms of politics, the law as the law. You have to think about the relationship between the two. And this is what Rousseau was always very interested in doing. He was a clever, clever fellow. And it's important to try and see that he was thinking. And we should try and think along with him as much as we can, because I think we won't necessarily do all that badly if we do.
Very much. I will not continue with any comparable deep analysis, but rather with several stereotypes that are connected to Rousseau. In answering your question, I think it is important to maybe to remind that for many readers of Rousseau, one of the possible introduction was Jacob Talmont's a book on Rousseau, inspiration of all the wrongs done by revolutions in the 20th century. So this is exactly the way I find possible to ascribe to that perspective that he was something like a proto-Marxist, or and that's it, that this was his ideology. But as you know, it is even easier to read his oeuvre, and especially some parts of considerations on Polish government, as proto-green ideology or proto-preservationist ideology, to stop people from misusing nature through their greed. This is that perspective that would be developed in Romanticism, of course. And this is another stereotypical way of reading Rousseau, as pre-romantic, of course. I give up, of course, I give up that duty to Professor Sonendscher, whether the stereotypes are valid, any comment, or just a shrug of shoulder. Nevertheless, that's how Rousseau is frequently read. And I think what is probably most stereotypically attached to Rousseau is that he liked, and this is what Professor Butterwick stressed in the beginning of his introduction, namely that Rousseau wanted to be provocative. So Rousseau wanted to stress tensions between different ideals, between different possibilities, between different sets of values. And I think we can find in his work, that's why he's so interesting, the most important tensions between community and individual, between state and empire, between republic and monarchy, and so on and so forth. So I think that we can read Rousseau, of course, not only in context of Polish late 18th century realities, and not only in the context of early 19th century philosophy and its developments, as Cambridge School would do. But I think that we can always read Rousseau as an element of something like an eternal or multi-secular debate of philosophers, beginning with Plato. So I think that we cannot read Rousseau, communism, or something like a new version of Plato's Republic communism, but I think that his stress on diminishing differences between the richest, the oligarchy, and those petty noblemen, because he didn't consider actually peasants, of course, in his considerations, is something that we can find in Plato's laws. This is the direction in his argument developed in consideration on Polish government, not to introduce communism, not to eradicate completely rich people, but to diminish differences. And this is something that might be seen as a stereotypical whole that is both preservationist, is both Republican, is both pre-revolutionary and pre-romantic. And that's the way I, as non-specialist, read Rousseau.
Thank you both very much for those final remarks. Thank you for everyone who's contributed to this discussion. We shall be starting again tomorrow at 9:30 in the morning. We are about to sort of go through into the ante-room where there is a reception that has been laid on so that we can continue discussions on a more informal basis. So thank you again to our two panelists this evening, Andrzej Nowak and Michael SONENSCHER.